In December 1990, within hours, traffic stopped. Drivers abandoned their cars. Entire communities were cut off. Ordinary expectations before the winter. December 1990. As autumn gave way to December 1990, Britain had little reason to brace for anything extraordinary. The preceding years had delivered relatively mild winters, and the public mood was one of routine seasonal preparation. Buying coats, checking the car, stocking up on basics. The government issued no unusual warnings. The Met Office tracked a weather system developing across the Atlantic, but nothing suggested the country was about to face one of the most disruptive winters in a generation. Then, on the night of 7th to 8th December 1990, a cold front descended across central England. Within hours, what had begun as an unremarkable December evening became something else entirely. Snow began falling over the Midlands, Wales, and the Pennines, and it did not stop for most of the following day. The rate of accumulation was striking, around 6 centimeters per hour, which meant that many areas were buried under a visible layer within just 30 minutes of the snow beginning. The landscape transformed quickly and, at first, beautifully. Then the disruption began: transport breakdown and national disruption. The sheer speed of accumulation overwhelmed road networks almost immediately. Vehicles became stranded on main roads and motorways, drivers abandoned cars, and gridding operations could not keep pace with the rate of snowfall. All rail services in the Midlands were cancelled outright. Bus routes across affected areas ground to a halt. Schools closed across wide regions as local authorities concluded it was unsafe for children to travel. In rural communities, the effect was more severe still. Villages in Derbyshire, where drifts reached 2 feet, found themselves effectively cut off from surrounding towns. Supply chains buckled under the pressure, with delivery lorries unable to move and distribution depots struggling to operate. Supermarket shelves in some areas began to empty. Approximately 650,000 people were left without electricity, and around 1.2 million lost access to running water as pipes froze and infrastructure buckled under the cold. The weight of wet snow brought down telephone and power lines across the Midlands, snapping wooden poles that had stood for decades. For much of Britain, ordinary daily life simply stopped. January 1991. Atmospheric shift, storms and structural damage. Most of the December snow cleared within 4 days, but the winter was far from over. The rest of December remained unsettled, and by Christmas Day, a deep depression centered to the north of Britain, recorded at a central pressure of 955 millibars, was driving violent squalls across the country. Then, on 5th and 6th January 1991, the UK and Ireland were struck by severe gales that proved far more deadly than the December snowfall. Gusts reached 70 miles per hour across Ireland and the southwest of England, bringing down trees and power lines and leaving thousands of homes without electricity. Roofs were damaged, structures were compromised, and the power grid across large sections of the country failed. The storms resulted in 30 deaths across the UK and Ireland combined. Among those killed were 11 crew members lost from 2 merchant vessels, a couple struck by a falling tree while walking near Brighton, and 13 people who died in Ireland as a result of falling trees and related accidents, 7 of them aboard a minibus that was hit by a collapsing tree. Flooding. After snowmelt. As the storm systems moved through and temperatures briefly lifted, the December snowpack began to melt rapidly. The ground, already saturated from heavy rain and frozen at depth, could absorb very little of the meltwater. Rivers rose quickly. In areas across England and Wales, watercourses burst their banks and water pushed into streets, homes, and commercial premises. Property damage mounted. Carpets, furniture, electrical systems, and structural fittings were ruined as floodwater entered ground floors. The sequence of events: heavy snow, structural storm damage, and then flooding, created a compounding chain of disaster that no single phase alone would have produced. Infrastructure that had survived the snowfall was then tested again by flood damage, and communities that had only just begun recovering from one crisis found themselves facing another within weeks. Human casualties and economic consequences. Across the winter as a whole, the human cost was significant. The December snow event alone killed 10 people in the UK, predominantly in road accidents. The January storms added 30 more deaths across the UK and Ireland. The economic losses were substantial. Retail takings on the Saturday following the December snowfall, 3 weeks before Christmas, normally one of the busiest shopping days of the year, fell sharply as people could not reach town centers. The disruption to electricity and water supply, the repair of power lines, the replacement of damaged infrastructure, the flooding claims, and the costs borne by transport operators and local authorities together represented a serious financial burden on both the public and private sectors. Rural communities faced particular hardship. Isolated villages, stranded livestock, and extended periods without basic services placed extraordinary demands on local resources and emergency responders. February 1991. Second major cold wave. Before Britain could fully recover, a second major cold event arrived. In early February 1991, a mass of cold air originating from the north and east pushed across the country, bringing with it heavier and more widespread snowfall than December had delivered. This was not a regional event. Much of England and Wales was affected simultaneously, and the cold was more penetrating. Temperatures in many areas did not exceed -5 degrees Celsius even during daylight hours, and overnight readings fell as low as -11.7 degrees Celsius. Snow depths across England exceeded 10 centimeters widely, with the Derby area recording up to 60 centimeters and drifts on the Welsh mountains reaching 4 meters. Bingley in Yorkshire recorded 20 inches of snowfall. Roads across the country were closed again. Flight operations were suspended at multiple airports. Rail services were disrupted across wide sections of the network. The frost was severe and prolonged, and communities that had managed the December event with resilience now faced the same conditions again, with fewer reserves of patience or preparation. Historical context and record significance. The winter of 1990 to 91 was, by any measure, significant in the modern record. It was the coldest British winter since January 1987, a fact documented across meteorological sources of the period. The snowfall seen in many parts of the United Kingdom during both the December and February events was not matched again until the snowfall of February 2009, nearly 2 decades later. The winter entered public memory as a dual event. the December snowstorm, which struck so suddenly and so heavily that it paralyzed the Midlands within an afternoon, and the February freeze, which confirmed that the winter had been no passing anomaly. For many who lived through it, the sequence of snow, storm, flood, and freeze across those months remains a reference point against which subsequent winters are measured. Modern infrastructure versus natural forces. One of the clearest lessons of the 1990 to 91 winter was that modern infrastructure, however sophisticated by the standards of its time, remained deeply vulnerable to sustained or sudden natural stress. Power networks relying on above-ground lines and wooden poles could not withstand the weight of wet snow combined with gale-force winds. Road systems designed for normal conditions could not function once substantial snowfall arrived without adequate pretreatment and response capacity. Rail networks dependent on electrified lines and level crossings faced the same vulnerabilities. The disruption to water supply affecting 1.2 million people illustrated how interconnected systems, when one element fails, can cascade into broader failures. These were not failures born of negligence. They reflected the limits of systems designed for average conditions when confronted with exceptional ones. Legacy and present day. Question: more than 3 decades on, the winter of 1990 to 91 is remembered as a turning point in how Britain understood its relationship with severe weather. It revealed the gap between expectation and reality, between a country that assumed it could absorb a hard winter and the reality of what such a winter actually demands. The storm deaths of January 1991, the flooded homes, the stranded vehicles, the weeks without electricity or water in some areas. These are not abstract statistics, but lived experiences that shaped attitudes toward winter preparedness for years afterward. The question the winter leaves behind is not simply historical. Given that comparable snowfall did not return until 2009, and that infrastructure investment in resilience remains an ongoing challenge, it is worth asking whether a winter of the same character today would be handled differently, or whether modern Britain remains as exposed to the same chain of vulnerabilities that the winter of 1990 to 91 so comprehensively exposed. Behind every storm, there are human stories. Subscribe, and let's continue telling them together. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.